couple of things. One in particular, it's always futures, not future. It's not suggesting that there is a crystal ball and you can see all sorts of trends and therefore determine what happens. It's about anticipation, not about prediction. It's the second thing. So that whole notion of anticipation is key to the futures literacy space. All right, so anticipation. I said that's really critical. And if you think about, sometimes you'll see that someone comes up with 10 trends for what might happen, or they'll say this is what's happening in technology, and that's a useful part of futures. But in the anticipation space, we're really talking about what are all the options, what's actually happening out there in the discipline of anticipation. And this is something that can be trained, so you can get better at it. And in the work that I do with leaders, no matter what sort of level or type of organization, it's talking about more about the mindsets, about our ways of thinking, rather than just producing some tools and strategies. So in the future space, yep, there's a lot of things like futures wheels and futures triangles and scenarios, etc., that form an important part of the toolbox, or what we call a kite here in New Zealand. But unless mindsets change, we know that really there's not going to be a change in our organisation. So these three things, the how we look at the future shapes how we act today. So we all bring to this space our own personal assumptions and ways of behaving, and that's critical for us to develop our own thinking and understanding about our own thought patterns and how that entrains and affects what we do today. And later on I'll share some of the critical ways of asking questions that maybe are more expansive in terms of their thinking. The second point is that every vision of the future is based on assumptions. I sort of talked a little bit about that before. Is we all come from different places, different contexts, different experiences, and that colours our futures thinking, the way we interpret the world, and also what we think of other people and other alternatives. So sometimes you might hear about a new possibility, a new future, and you go, oh, there's just no way on earth that could happen, or I don't like that future. That's all part of the conversation that we have internally. What is it that makes me feel negative about this idea, or what makes me feel angry, or why don't I think this is a possibility? So those conversations are important. And the third one is that anticipation changes the present. So we often say in the future space that we look at all sorts of different options out there, and then we bring it back to today and use it today. So the past, the present, and the future, they're all interwoven. So I just want to touch on some of the research on futures literacy. And to be clear that this is sort of it is a discipline at its purest. It's an academic pursuit, but it's also something that is deeply engaging, and it can be tangible. So it doesn't, when people sometimes think about futures, they think it's this big picture and it doesn't have any validity for taking action. That's absolutely not the case. This is just some of the points about futures literacy from UNESCO, who have a whole secretariat area in the futures literacy space. And so some of you will know Real Miller or Lewis Stamhoff, who work in this space. And these are some of the reasons that they consider futures literacy to be a really important place. And so I'm not going to go through all of those, just take a look at them for a moment and just see which ones stand out to you and which ones possibly make the most sense. Or in a few moments, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions about some of those different points. So UNESCO have a strong futures literacy piece of research and ongoing literacy labs, which we're not going to cover today, but they are in the more provocative space. There's some great things happening that I suggest you go onto their site and have a look at their work. But I also want to talk about this work from some of the Australian team. So this is from the Centre for Strategic Education. They put out some really great resources. And this particular one that I came across last year is the Future of Educational Leadership 5 Signposts. And I don't know if any of you have come across Valerie Hannon. She's an institution in the global education landscape, involved in the innovation unit out of the UK and also in Australia and New Zealand, but has global impact, and Anthony Mackay, who also has global impact in that sort of space. Two amazing people. And so they talk about, in the UNESCO space, about futures literacy being a capability. It's a skill that allows people to better understand the role of the future and what they see and do. Being futures literate empowers the imagination, enhances our ability to prepare, recover, and invent as changes occur. So when I saw this particular piece, I was really taken by it. And what they said in terms of the needs for leaders of the future were these 5 signposts. Love them all. And when I read them, while these are from an education perspective, these are just as applicable for any type of business. So the leading the creation of a new education narrative could just as easily lead the creation of a new organizational narrative. All right, the leading with ecosystems, the understanding of complexity, and how things impact on each other. Leading for equity, and we know that globally the equity gap has increased and is likely to continue to increase. The lead for innovation, and music to my ears, leads for the future of literacy. And so it's really that one that I want to focus on. But you can see you've got UNESCO, and then you've got this example of a lot of the literature and the things that are out there in the futures literacy space. So yeah, why do futures literacy? Well, first of all, whenever you're doing any leadership program, you know that it always starts with personal leadership. And so for me, in this sort of futures literacy space, in the strategic foresight, etc., this is about really understanding our own conditioning and assumptions, and therefore what we hold dear and what we are fearful of, and yeah, just letting that rest with us, and then also using it to open up other possible viewpoints and perceptions. So by becoming more futures literate and having a look at the wider environment, you can really enhance your own perceptions of what's happening there. So there's a whole lot of tools and strategies that can help you to keep scanning and being really aware of what's happening out there. And we'll talk a little bit about those in the second section. So that the observational skills and just the conscious awareness of impact for yourselves and your schools or your organizations is critical. I think too, in the world of increased diversity and a focus on inclusion, that this is a really good set of skills, capabilities, and mind frames to help you think about how diverse your organizations are. And it's also, I've got in there the imagine multiple and diverse futures so we don't become path dependent. So our world is increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and in that space we need to be able to react quite quickly to change. And so what we don't want to do is have entrained thinking that just puts us down that one-way bridge and we don't have alternatives. And that's the critical space that that futures literacy helps you to avoid, really. It helps embrace complexity, and some of you may know the work of David Snowden and the Cynefin framework. So it's definitely a lot of this work fits in the complex, like, oh, there's multiple ideas, there's not one solution. Sometimes we've just got to try things out or sit comfortably in that space of disorder and that sense of agency. So in this space, one of the critical things is that as you learn more about the future, it's also exploring how you might influence the future. Which bits can you influence and which bits can't you influence? And really creating for yourselves personally and for your organisation that whole sense of hope, because without hope, there is no purpose. So it's it is an opportunity to think about the positive futures and how you might influence them to become real, and the stories that you might tell in that sort of space. So I'm just going to pause a little bit there. So that's a little bit of the background to futures literacy and some of the places you might go to find out more. And Andrew, just hand back to you for a moment for any questions or clarifications that people might have.
Okay then, I'll go for it. Luckily Cheryl's in New Zealand, so this will be a New Zealand specific question. So yeah, this is Michael Harvey. I've now been made Director of Esport at Marlborough Boys. Yeah, so my question's around the introduction of essentially possibly co-governance models in terms of education.
Yep.
And the introduction of Mātauranga Māori, especially into the New Zealand curriculum. So just seeing where you might see the opportunities. I see more opportunities, but from my perspective of teachers, there seems to be also a lot of pushback. Sorry for the international audience, but yeah. And just basically where you see possibly this co-governance model potentially moving.
Yeah, well, I'd love to talk to you offline about that a little bit too, but the whole idea of co-governance, for those of you in other places that might not quite understand that, is that you might have two people as principals of the school, or a different model for either leading or governing. And the thing that springs to mind, Michael, is a tool we're not going to cover today, but called the Futures Triangle, that looks at the weights of the past, the push of the present, and the pull of the future, and how those three interact, because you're dealing, whatever the change, you're dealing with historical behaviours and expectations of society. And I think that's the same no matter what type of organisation you've got. It's that it's people really being convinced that it might be a way forward when they haven't experienced it. And so that for me becomes the bigger question about purpose, and why you might suggest a co-governance type model or whatever change is to really have a compelling vision and purpose for change, and then to also consider what's happening now and what's getting in the way in today's world, whether it be just things like COVID or legislation, etc., but also to go back and look at those historical things. And in your case, in a small city that's got quite set expectations, perhaps, and how you might introduce change in an ongoing way. So part of the future space is, what do I change? How do I back map from the future I want back to today's reality, and do it in bite-sized chunks, but also knowing that there isn't a linear pathway, and you're talking about people's behaviours and their views of the world, and that's always complex. So I don't know if that helps, but it's there's certainly some tools and strategies that would help in that space. In terms of mataranga Māori, so again, for our international audience, the space of our indigenous people and our Treaty of Waitangi that we have that underpins our work. For me, I'm tangata treaty, so that's important for us to focus on. And so the last thing I'll say in answer to that question is that a lot of the models of futures are based on North American models, but there are also some very good Indigenous models from New Zealand, Canada, Philippines that we can draw on that look at futures from an Indigenous perspective, and that's really important too from a futures literacy space to explore different worldviews and how they can be brought into the conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Because every different culture actually has a different perception of what the actual future is.
Yeah.
Or even time, for example, Africa tends to have a model of looking backwards. Anyway, won't dwell on. But it's kind of the important thing for me just to finish off as a statement is the idea that that the future is not set in concrete, and you kind of have to have aspirational goals and work backwards rather than say, well, it's a fait accompli. Yeah, so that's kind of
absolutely agree. And in English, one of the whakatauki of Maori is that you walk into the future backwards, and so the history and all your ancestors are part of who you are, your past, present, and future. Is different from being separate things that we might look at them. I'm a New Zealand Pākehā or of European descent, so my views of time are quite different from some of my Maori colleagues. Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Andrew, and certainly that's something that we're all living through probably now, and certainly post-quake and other stages that in my work with as chair of the Brain Research Institute, the brain craves certainty, and so it looks for pathways and patterns, and it's really hard to think about the future when you're in a survival mode or highly stressed. So it's small steps. But my noticings about teachers and principals and schools at the moment in our context is there's so much to do, and there's no staff, and there's students away sick, and all those sorts of ongoing things. For some of those people, it's just having some time with someone where they can lift themselves from the dance floor to the balcony, even if it's just a small segment that just can help them draw breath and think about the bigger picture. So it is about finding just a little bit of time for those that are ready, and acknowledging that it's not that easy. So I'll sort of carry on with some of the examples of what you might do in this future space, and that might clarify a little bit more. Anticipation is critical for me. So that these in the futures literacy work, they talk about anticipatory systems, and so Real Miller from UNESCO frames it in 3 different sorts of anticipatory systems, and I'm just going to briefly mention these because they're all really, really important for futures thinking, but they do slightly different things. And then I'll just provide you with some practical examples. So the first 2 really go together. So you've got planning and preparation, and so in the future space, they are a critical part of what we do as well. So they together make anticipation for the future, and they impact on decision making. So the first one, the planning, is how are we going to optimize things for our personally, for our schools, for our organizations, whatever it happens, whatever our context is. And so I'm going to use this to make decisions about the desirable future, or what we sometimes call the preferred future. And I want to just reduce uncertainty about the direction. So this is what it's going to look like. This is our what we're heading for. This is a day in the life of our school, etc. So coming back to the being able to think from a futures point of view, Andrew, that this is sometimes the opening door for people to think in the future space, because it just provides a little bit of certainty about what it might look like. So I can see a small pathway. And then the preparation is for contingency. I always use the analogy of, I wonder if it's going to rain today. Maybe I need to take my umbrella. Oh, I'm not sure. There might be some more cases of COVID. We'll need to be prepared for this, but that might happen. And so you are considering these sort of multiple pieces so that you can be more prepared for what might happen during the day or the year, or whatever you've got planned. So they're both really important parts of the future and of the futures literacy framework. Beyond that, you'll see what's called anticipation for emergence. And so the space of emergence is the space of not knowing, the unknown unknowns. And I'm sort of quite comfortable in that space. I know that it's going to change all the time. There's lots of things I don't know. And when I do find them out, actually, I've just got more questions that arise from that. So it's not a place of certainty. It's a place, though, where there's a whole lot of novel things that could emerge that I've never thought of before. And so this is the space of really asking some critical, deep questions that move your thinking. And you leave a session or a conversation thinking, wow, I've got no idea how that happened or where that went, but something good can come out of this. I'm going to start designing this new thing. Or, you know what, I've got more questions and I'm going to go away and do some more reading or talk to some more people. So that's the space of, I don't know, we've got to make it up as we go. We've got to think of new things, and we can't use things in the past to in the same way. And so sometimes people refer to that as the used future. Like it's served a purpose once, but you know what? It doesn't serve a need anymore, but we keep doing it because we're entrained to do it, or we're too frightened to let it go, or there's pressure to maintain that sort of thing. So that exploration, that anticipation for emergence, I think is a really boundary pushing part of futures literacy. So I just want to give you a couple of examples of some tools in the future space. This is the first one. This is a tool I've developed based on other people's reading and so on, that I call the futures retrospective. And some of you that come from maybe a technology background or have done some agile work will know that a retrospective typically looks back at what's been done. And there's some questions that you can use, but essentially you're trying to improve things in the future by learning from the past. And so in a futures retrospective, you do that, but you do it as if you are in the future, right? So it asks you to consider how you got there. So, excuse me. So here's just a short retrospective that I will just leave you to have a read for a minute. So I want you to presume that you are in 2032 and you're online on this meeting. EduSpark's come a long way. It's got all these new funky tools, but essentially here you are in EduSpark, 10 years down the track. Andrew's probably aged a bit, so have you, but you're still pretty much onto it. but the world has changed, and you know what? Your organization's no longer fit for purpose. The 3 C's, climate change, conflict, COVID, haven't gone away. That's accelerated. And so learning, if we focus on that, much more automated and what I call botified, so run by bots, and hasn't really kept up with the importance of the weaving of people, place, planet, and purpose. The young people in your school or your organization or your staff, etc., saying, what's the point? This is just not working. Oof, okay, not so good. So let's take it to the next stage of the retrospective, and it sort of goes like this. So in thinking 10 years out and what I've described as the scenario, what advice would you give yourselves today to avoid this? And maybe you can just put some comments in the chat. But this becomes a really good strategy or tool for you to think about one possible scenario and then to consider what you might do to avoid it, because this is a completely plausible scenario. And what you can do with this idea is even can create some different scenarios. So one that is more optimistic, one that is less optimistic. It's probably not so useful with the business as usual type scenarios, but there are multiple things that could happen. Set that scene and then come back to what advice would you give yourselves today. And if you do this as a team, then that can help you set some guidelines for where you want to take your organization in the future. And one of the processes for that is to then sort of back map how you might go to an avoiding place and turn it into a positive. So that's one tool or strategy I suggest. The other is the importance of the scanning process. So the World Economic Forum and their research in the future space, they talk about the critical nature of futures literacy skills as well. So bonus to them. And they talk about the importance of continually scanning the environment. And there's a couple of critical things here, really. One is that it's not one person's job to scan. It's everyone's job to look at what's happening in the world and to bring some of those ideas and to set some time aside to sort of say, well, what are you noticing happening? Anyone got some interesting new research or ideas? And so this is one of the examples that we did on our Miro board using a framework from Amy Webb. This is her fringe sketch process, and I really like Amy's work. She's a quantitative futurist, and she has these 11 things around the outside that she thinks are the critical elements of a scan. But the important thing about this is, in this case, we were looking at the future of work, but we weren't just looking at it from our own perspective, but from what's happening in the world, and sometimes things that don't seem to have any relation to our own industry or our own way of being. And so the secret of scanning is to look for what we call weak signals, the things that are out there. They don't seem to link, but there's this little kernel of an idea or something happening on the fringe that we might just need to be aware of, because that's the place where we can find things that might completely blindside us in our industry at a later stage. So I do encourage you to do some scanning, to look at ways of scanning and maybe find some of the different places that you can go online and learn what's happening out there, and to do it beyond your own industry. So how do you do that? Well, the last really tool or idea that I want to share with you in a bit more depth is this whole idea of framing the question and deciding what your focus is. And this fits in a lot with the work of appreciative inquiry as well, is the way you articulate your question or frame your focus area completely alters what you then do next. So it comes coming back to that anticipation. Yep. What's the assumption you make from your question leads you down a particular track. So let's look at a school example. I don't know your country or situation, but I know that globally, a lot of schools are challenged with the number of students that are turning up because of concerns about COVID or sickness, or because they're having to go and support their parents and go to work, etc. So here's a question. How can we stop truancy in our school? In other words, children not going to school, right? So that's one question. Now let's have a look at this second question. And this sort of interests me because they sort of want the same thing, but by framing the question, the how they tackle the question can change completely. I've had some really interesting conversations down this track because some people say, well, do we want to create a school that no one wants to leave? And that's another conversation, but a really a good one. But yeah, the first one could lead you down a more punitive track of tracking and checking and punishing, perhaps. But the other is about a pull to a future that is so positive and useful and connects to the young people that are served that they don't want to leave until they have to. Right, so that's one lot. But then I was also thinking about it with a podcast I was listening to this week from the Future School, Frank and Yvette, who do amazing work, and they've got a whole lot of free resources and ideas this year. But I was thinking about it in terms of the questions that you might ask, say, from a schooling perspective. So the first one is, you know, what's the future of Richmond School, or the future of Marlborough Boys School, or your international school, whatever it happens to be. And then you have a look at the other questions that broaden out. So schooling in more general terms, then education, and then learning. Question, what does learning look like 10 years from now? They're all slightly different focuses. And what we'd say in this space is, if you have a narrow focus, then you're going to research and find out information that reinforce that dominant narrative of what a school is, or the official view of what your organisation's about. So the art of framing the question and the focus is to keep it broad enough to something like, what's the future of learning isn't actually about schools, it's about the whole nature of where will people learn, who will learn, will ages learn together, what's a physical space for learning, is that important, what are the technologies, and it opens up a whole lot of different places so that when you're doing your scanning, you're looking much more broadly. So that's why I think the framing of the questions and the determining your focus for your organisation as it moves to the future is critical. So I also just want to share some other questions that you can use to really push into the emergent and equity pause sort of space when you're involved in conversations, strategic conversations, or you've been working in a meeting and it's time to just step back, go up to the balcony again and ask some different questions. So just have a look at these questions and maybe think for yourself, which one do I think is a really useful question for me to take back to my own environment for tomorrow? And so again, in offering these questions, these are just some of the bank of questions that we can use. And you might say, you know what, we're going to pull one of these out of the hat at our meetings and just use that as our closing point that brings our meeting to a conclusion, but also takes us to a next step. Or we might ask one person to identify a question that they think needs to be addressed at our next meeting. All right, so it's always looking for what are we going to do next to challenge our own thinking or to move out of entrainment into the space of not knowing and needing to find out. So this is a continual purpose of developing our futures muscles. And then the last thing I'll share before I just hand back to Andrew and with a couple of slides to finish is that in the Christchurch Ōtautahi space, one of the things that I've been doing is growing a futures community. And so if you think about this as learning ecosystem, or you think about it as a community of practice, it's the same sort of thing as groups of people coming together because they've got a similar interest in this case, in futures. So what we did during the first lockdown here was I worked with a group of 10 people completely online. And we used some of the work of Sahil Inayatullah, who's one of the world's leading futurists, and I used that as the spine. But I created a program and a conversation for them about futures, and that developed into a really useful group of people from really diverse industries, which I think is pretty key, working together and thinking about futures perspectives, challenging each other's mindsets, but also practicing the tools. So you'll see there's some of the people online from, as I say, all sorts of different industries, and that grew to a second cohort of 10, to a face-to-face cohort, and then another sort of a hybrid cohort based here in Christchurch, with the idea of growing a futures literate city. And so if you think about it in your context, how might you grow a group of people who have the ongoing conversations about the future? Because that's part of the magic, is not just saying we went to a course and we learned some tools and strategies about futures. And you'll see over on the right-hand side, one of the people that came to one of the sessions was the managing director of a company here in Christchurch called Hamilton Jet, and he created his own workshop using some of the tools that we'd learnt to run with his leadership team in New Zealand. And then some of the other members of our Ōtautahi Futures Collective, they came along as volunteers to practice and to help run the workshop. And then Ben also did the same process online with his teams that were overseas. And so the idea of starting with a small cohort and then building out and continuing the conversation and sharing the load, learning together, comes back to it's everyone's job to scan, and it's everyone's job to keep growing their sort of futures mindset. So I'm just going to hand back to you, Andrew, before I finish my last slide.